So we are going through our kind of our lead up to lectureship here in about what are we, a month away, just under a month maybe, from lectureship. So we're building up to that, and the theme of the lectureship this year is the world at our doorstep. And so we've had a couple of lessons leading up to that, and so this morning we're going to look at Mark chapter 11. And with Jesus at the temple. And so what I want us to, as we do look at that this morning, to keep this theme of the world at our doorstep in our minds, as we will relate to that this morning, but as we kind of lead up to that weekend with that idea in mind. So we're going to look at a story about Jesus that has been mentioned many times. This story of Jesus at the temple has been read over many times and many discussions over what exactly was going on, what was Jesus feeling, why was he doing the things that he was doing, and right the repercussions of it and all that was going on. And so this morning we'll look at Mark chapter 11, where Jesus enters the temple and sees something that really disturbed him. So to start, the temple was not just a place for the Jews to come and worship and to sacrifice. It was also a place, as our reading this morning indicated, that anyone could come and pray and to seek God. When Jesus comes and sees this place being used for personal and commercial gain, he needs to make a statement about it. He needs to make sure people understand what this place is and what should be going on. So as we look through the lesson this morning, I want us to be thinking about two related things. How do we treat our times with God? And how do our times with God affect people coming from the world? So I have a few questions to think about concerning these things. Do we treat our faith as a convenient or sometimes inconvenient secondary path in our lives? Are there areas of our lives where commercial interests or worldly anxieties have crowded out our prayer life? Does our worship make it easier or harder for the nations to come and find God? Now, I know that could be a lot of questions all at once there, but simply put, how does coming to God affect us and those around us? That's what I want us to think about this morning. So we're going to look at the story with Jesus and look at the context of the situation. We'll also see that though this is a unique moment in time, things like what we'll see in this account has been happening ever since. So there's a quick little, more kind of modern story, somewhat modern, that shows this kind of thing has continued on, and then we'll get into the text. But it says, in the mid-19th century, there was this young man from a lower class background, and he was trying to enter a prestigious, what would be considered a high society church in London. He was looking for hope. But when he got to the door, he was told by the ushers that the pew rents had all been paid by wealthy families, and there was no room for him. He was told to stand in the back, or better yet, to find a mission chapel for people of his kind. He left that day feeling that God was only for the wealthy and the connected. As we'll see this morning, the religious leaders didn't tell people to leave, but they filled the lobby with so much noise and commerce that someone seeking for God couldn't even hear themselves pray. Jesus knew people needed a place to come and experience God. So let's get into the text and see what happens and how Jesus reacts to it. So Mark chapter 11, verses 15 and 16. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry through the temple. We have Jesus here entering the temple. As we see it here, he doesn't enter the temple just to observe what's going on, but he enters it to overhaul what is happening. The world has moved in. The worldly life has entered the temple, and there is seemingly no distinction between inside the temple and out. Spiritual preparation has now been replaced with simply financial transactions. So we'll look at what was going on here in a minute in a little bit more detail. But simply put, people were buying sacrifices on site rather than bringing their own. And worship had become a one-stop shop, rather than this heartfelt sacrifice that it was meant to be at this time. The money changers were stationed in the court of the Gentiles, the only place where outsiders could come and to pray and to seek God. We see a convenient shortcut mentality with the people here. Why not bring the market to where the people are going instead of waiting for the people to come to the market? Mark here notes that Jesus wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the courts. They were using the holy space as a shortcut to the city market, treating it not as a holy place, but just another place to do business in. So we can look at it with a little more detail of what is the context of what is happening in the temple here. So we can have a good understanding of what's going on. And I won't go into a lot of detail. There'll be a lot that could be discussed on this, but quickly we'll look at it. The first is the currency exchange. The Jewish law required every male adult to pay an annual temple tax. That temple tax was half a shekel. And we see this in Exodus 30, verse 13. This was part of the law. And so it is commonly understood that about half a shekel would be understood as about 2 days' wages for the average laborer of the first century. And the rich and the poor would pay the half shekel. It didn't matter if you were very poor or really wealthy. Everybody paid the half shekel. Doesn't matter who you were, that was what was expected. The problem was that people coming at this time arrived from all over the Roman Empire. And so they were carrying money that was considered unclean pagan coins. Like the Roman denarius was an example of that. That coin which bore the image of Caesar, which would be considered an idol to the religious leaders here in the temple. So money changers set up tables to swap these foreign coins for the Tyrian shekel, which had a higher silver content, but no adulterous Roman images on it. So you came in with a coin with Caesar on it, you couldn't give that to the temple, you had to get it swapped out. So the friction came when the money changers, seeing this, charged significant fees for this service. By Jesus' time, these tables had migrated from the city markets, where they had once been, right into the court of the Gentiles, turning a sacred place into a loud, high-interest currency exchange situation. What was supposed to be a special time with God had turned into just another money-making endeavor. People had to do their duty and were now confronted with this structure that was taking advantage of them. Money wasn't the only one. Besides the money, there was also animals that needed to be sacrificed. Worshippers were required to offer an unblemished animal here at the temple. So that included things like lambs and cattle, and also for doves for the poor. But there was a level then, if it needed to be unblemished, of quality control. If a traveler brought a lamb from home, It had to be inspected by the temple officials to see if it was worthy. And often, it would be disqualified. Often for just a minor blemish. Just something a little bit maybe was off, or that they had seen was off. And this would force the traveler then to buy a pre-approved animal from the temple stalls. Now with this came along, of course, a price hike. These temple-approved animals were sold at a massive markup. So this created a monopoly where the poor were often were often priced out of worship. They couldn't even afford to do it. They couldn't even afford to do the things that the law required of them because of the system that had been built up. I think to us this sounds all too familiar to our world today. This isn't a foreign idea to us that people would do such a thing. Not much had changed, really, in the business world in 2,000 years. There's always people willing to do whatever they can to look at whatever situation is there to make a profit, disregarding any moral implications that might come with it. So we see that in verse 17. It says, "And he was teaching them and saying to them, Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." Jesus uses here two Old Testament references to define the temple's true purpose. The first is Isaiah 56:7, which says, "These I will bring to my holy mountain. I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And Jeremiah 7:11, it says, "Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord." The temple was meant to be a beacon for all nations to come and seek God. By turning the Gentile court into a shopping mall, the religious leaders were effectively canceling the mission to the world, preventing them from coming and seeking God. When Jesus mentions the den of robbers, the den that he is speaking of here is where thieves would go to feel safe after they've committed crimes. It'd be like their hideout or their safe house that we would see kind of in modern storytelling. Jesus is accusing the people of living worldly lives all week, then using the temple as this safe zone to hide from God's judgment. That the temple had become a place where it was okay to get away with corruption instead of a place of moral enlightenment. We see this idea of the house of nations with the temple. The temple was designed in concentric circles of holiness. The court of the Gentiles, this was the outermost massive courtyard, where anyone, Jews or Gentiles, could walk. This was intended to be a place of quiet prayer for anyone to come. By allowing the market to be set up here, the religious leaders were effectively saying that the spiritual needs of the nations were less important than the convenience of the Jewish market. They saw a big opportunity during Passover to make a lot of money. And they took over the spiritual place where people would go and seek God for their own benefit. This left a hole where people would not be able to come to God as was intended within the temple. So we see the response. In verse 18, "And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking for a way to destroy him. For they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished with his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city." The response to the cleansing reveals where people's hearts were to the religious things going on. They were caught up with their own agendas. that they ignored the real reason for the Passover. We see the response from the leaders. They didn't repent, see the error of their ways. They looked for a way to destroy him, to kill him. Why? Because Jesus threatened their bottom line. He threatened their control. They were not looking to serve God. They were serving their purposes. God was just a way to further their own agenda and their own power. But we also see the crowd's astonishment. The common people were astonished by the teachings of Jesus. They could see in him a real heart for God. A difference from the religious leaders that were supposed to be showing God to the people. Truth has a way of clearing the air and of drawing people in. People are hungry for real truth. We see many young people today searching for that authenticity, the real truth amidst a world of corruption and deceit. This is true with some in the first century and is true in our world today. People seeking real truth. And when they hear it, they know it. They see something different in it. And these people saw that with Jesus. So now we move on to ourselves. What does this mean in our lives today? We do not have a temple to go to and worship like they did then. And fortunately, we don't need the temple as a specific place to go to come to God. We can do that anyway. The struggle is to make room for God without the other things of life coming in and affecting it. We have so many distractions and reasons for putting other things above our time with God. We can feel like God's always there, so I can come to him whenever I want, whenever I can. And this is true, but what happens is that we only come to God when we have nothing else going on. Because God's always there, we can come when it's convenient for us. This puts God way down on the priorities of life. The world comes into our life and demands our attention. So we give it our immediate attention and we plan to get to it right away. And then we'll get to God when we can. We can easily feel that we cannot ignore the demands of the world. That we need to give it attention right away. It's unfortunate to give the world immediate attention, but not God. It can happen so often with us without us even noticing that we're doing it. Before we notice, our time with God is almost non-existent, except for a couple hours on Sunday. We may not be openly defying God, but we may be letting the world into our space where God should be. As I said, we don't have the temple to go and seek God at today, but we can create distractions from going and seeking God in our lives. So what commercial interests or worldly anxieties have crowded out your prayer life with God? We need to let Jesus overhaul our priorities. Do you treat your faith simply as a shortcut for your own agenda? Or is the presence of God your ultimate destination? Does your life in worship make it easier or harder for the nations to find their way to God? And it's not just about you. It's about bringing others to Jesus as well. Does the way we come to God attract others to do so as well? we have made out time with God so we may have made out time with God so corporate, so formal, and so routine that someone coming in from the world would not see the Spirit. They would simply see people doing what they're supposed to do. And that's a concern we need to keep in mind. The religious leaders of Jesus' day saw an opportunity to trap people in a commitment they knew they had to make. And unfortunately, that's not all that common today either. There are people and organizations that I'm sure you can think of that have abused people's commitment to God for their own gains. This makes it difficult for others to come to Jesus, as they can point out that there's so much corruption in the name of Christ that has been happening for thousands of years. But we need to be a shining light amidst those issues, trying to show people who Jesus truly is and what it truly means to come to God. I asked a few questions at the beginning of the sermon this morning. Do we treat our faith as a convenient or inconvenient secondary path in our lives? Are there areas of our lives where commercial interests or worldly anxieties have crowded out our life with God? Does our worship make it easier or harder for the nations to find God? Maybe you have some answers for those questions. Maybe you're not sure. What I want us to think about this morning is how your commitment to God is going. Is it being choked out by the things of the world and of life? Have we just been going through the motions because we're supposed to? Are we in danger of taking something sacred and making it less than that? Taking something in our life that should be of utmost importance and using it only when it benefits or conveniences us. How does coming to God affect us? And how does it affect those around us? I want us to think about that this week. I want us to pray about that this week. Let us work towards being people that not only grow in God personally, but also are welcoming the world in to know Jesus. Thank you.